All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Workshop Wednesday. We're so happy to have you all here with us today to talk about mentorship. Before we start today's conversation with all of our panelists, I want to just briefly introduce the people and the work behind this workshop and the entire Workshop Wednesday series, as well as provide you with the general flow of today's event. So today's workshop has been organized by GSA's Career Development Subcommittee. Co-hosts and I have put together the blueprint of this event, but every member of the committee showcased here have been instrumental in making this event happen. Also, we want to give a special thanks to Jessica Velez, the Acting Director of Engagement for the Early Career Leadership Program, for providing us with essential technical coordination to our planning. The Career Development Subcommittee helps build relationships with professionals and companies in the larger scientific community to create deeper connections with the society and its members and to showcase the versatility of career paths open to all of you. With that said, the aim of today's workshop is to highlight effective mentorship strategies, which are important for all of us. Last but not least, I want to share a few notes and ground rules with everyone in attendance today. Please note that all the views and opinions shared in today's workshop are those of the panelists themselves and not of the organizations that they represent or have worked for. In addition, any mention of a company by a panelist is not an endorsement for that given company or brand. This workshop is a safe space, so we welcome you to ask honest questions to our panelists by dropping them in the chat box to everyone. However, if you're being disrespectful in this space, we will ask you to leave the workshop. So please be mindful of others. Members of our committee will be collecting questions from the chat box, and if they are not addressed in today's discussion, don't worry, we will make sure to provide answers after the workshop in our career resources. So you don't need to write down any notes or resources. We're going to compile everything after the workshop and send it out to all participants after the workshop. With that, we can begin today's discussion with an introduction of our panelists. So I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves, give us a brief statement about their research, and then also, since we're talking about mentorship today, why don't you share a mentor who has been important to you and how you identified them. Swathi, do you want to get us started off?
Sure, happy to. Thank you for putting this together and for inviting all of us. And thank you to all our participants who've joined. Hopefully this is an informative session on both ends, because I've learned that I learn a lot from my mentees about mentorship. And it's definitely a conversation that develops over time. So I am Swathi Arur. I'm an associate professor at MD Anderson Cancer Center in the Department of Genetics. And I work on C. elegans, or I use C. elegans as my model system. And what we really study is how maternal nutrition regulates, how maternal nutrition drives germ cell development. And recently we've been modeling a lot of our work in mammalian model systems like mice, and taking some of it to humans as well to see. A mentor that had a huge, I think, impact on my life was also my...
You got muted.
Oops, sorry about that. When did that happen? When did you lose me? So
you said special mentor in my life was, and then it cut off right there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So that was actually was also my advisor, and this was my graduate advisor. So I did my PhD from India, and this was from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in New Delhi. And my advisor was an MD PhD. He was a pediatrician who was also a microbiologist and an infectious disease biologist. And he had a huge impact on me, both in my science, but also in my, I think, career development, and a lot of my confidence, I think, that developed. And I'm happy to speak more about it as we go through.
Fantastic. We're happy to have you here. And Swathi is also one of our GSA board members, so extra special to have her on our panel today. Mohamed, do you want to share?
Sure, happy to. My name is Mohammed Noor. I'm a biology professor at Duke University, and I'm also currently serving as Dean of Natural Sciences here. My research area is broadly in evolutionary genetics. My current main funded research program is to look at and understand the nature of lethal causing variants found in natural populations of Drosophila. So we've been isolating them, determining what those mutations are, And why are they persisting? Because you would think natural selection would make them go away. So that's the research program I've been working on right now. Probably my most influential advisor goes all the way back to my undergrad advisor. His name was Professor Bruce Grant. I went to the College of William and Mary as an undergraduate. I first met him just because I took his evolutionary genetics class, and it was life-changing. It was so great. I used to sit in the front row just completely like captivated by what he was talking about. And I just honestly, it just came about from conversations. I would just chat with him. At one point in time, I just walked up to him and said, look, could I work with you this summer? And honestly, I was so naive. I didn't really know what it was to do an independent research study, but I just talked with him. He was the best, and he still is the best. I literally today, now obviously I graduated undergrad, 30 years ago now. I today have exchanged like 3 emails with him. So it just shows how long these relationships can continue on. But he would always spend a lot of time with me and really, really encouraged me in a way that I don't think anybody else ever has. He's definitely a role model in that regard too. So we can talk more about that as we get into the session. Thank you.
I love that advice. My undergraduate advisor has also continued to be really important. So, and last but not least, Kara, why don't you tell us a little bit?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kara McKinley. I'm an assistant professor of stem cell and regenerative biology at Harvard. And my lab studies the uterus and regeneration associated with menstruation and childbirth. To some extent, we do that in humans and in the house mouse model. And I'm super excited because we're about to start working in the spiny mouse model, which is the only rodent that's known to menstruate. So that's my favorite thing that we're doing right now. And my probably most meaningful mentor was my graduate advisor, Ian Cheeseman. And I came to grad school convinced I was going to be a protein folding person, biochemist, because it's what I had done as an undergrad. And I saw Ian give this talk before our rotation started and just thought that cell biology and cell division was the most amazing and most beautiful thing. And that was how I ended up in his lab. And I think I wasn't maybe as strategic about finding the right mentors as I should have been and as people are now. I just kind of lucked into having the best one. And he's been a really incredible part of my life, obviously always all the way through grad school and then through postdoc and now. And I'm super happy that I'm now at Harvard, he's at MIT, so he's just down the street and I've been able to see him, but I do probably talk to him on the phone at least once a month still. And he's the person I can talk to about the other things that I'm not really supposed to say out loud to other people, and to make me feel that those things are normal and okay.
Wonderful. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here today. So we're going to get started with, we've kind of split the workshop into 2 categories of questions. So first, we're going to start talking about mentorship sort of from the perspective of the mentee. So just to get the ball rolling, does someone want to tell us, what's the difference between an advisor and a mentor? Almost all of us, especially in graduate school, have someone who's a designated advisor, but advising and mentoring sometimes can be different things. So what do you think?
Maybe I'll kick us off there. I actually have been thinking about this question since I saw it come up, and I have to say, I'm not sure I've come up with an extremely precise answer, except that my biggest picture statement is that probably you will have 1, maybe max 2 advisors, and you should have many, many, many mentors. That the role of a mentor is extremely varied. I think even within what we might call mentorship, there are sort of subcategories, like we might include sponsorship, someone who says your name in rooms that matter. And that not everyone can be all of those things for you at once. And so really being able to find support and be able to have conversations and get, even though it's advice, you can get advice from your mentors. That's not a unique to advisor situation. And I think the one thing I did want to make a pitch for is the idea that although often the advisor-advisee relationship is a vertical one, the mentor-mentee relationship can be a lateral one. And that some of the most important mentors that have been in my life have been peer mentors. Obviously, Ian was my advisor, and that's still sort of a hierarchical relationship, but never discount the value of lateral mentorship and support.
I can jump in. That was fantastic, Kara. But I basically just build on some of the things that Kara mentioned too. I mean, they're obviously overlapping roles. The hope is your advisor will also always be your mentor. However, one of the great deficits of standard graduate training is we're not usually trained in how to either be an advisor or a mentor. We're actually trained in very little about what has to do with our ultimate job. It's kind of funny. We're only trained how to do the hands-on research, and then that ends up being a very small fraction of what we do. But your advisor, I mean, this is going to be somewhat field specific, right? In some cases, your advisor is a person who's basically like directing your research, and that depends on your subfield. But they may be saying like, you need to do this, you need to do that. But they're committed to helping you, but they also have an end game of their own that like, I need to see this research program, advanced. A mentor in principle can be somebody who has no stake in it whatsoever, except that they just seek to help you out. And all the things that Kara mentioned as well too. It doesn't have to be somebody who's senior to be. It could be somebody similar career stage, potentially even younger, maybe just giving some really good advice on things. But the mentor-mentee thing is it's less about directing you, and it's more about like hashing things out with you and letting you figure out what it is you need to do for whatever situation. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I can add my 2 cents worth. So I agree with, I think, what the other 2 panelists said, but to me, it's also a little more like an advisor, I think, is somebody who is an advisor is, I think, somebody who really, I mean, what Mohammed said is kind of in charge of advising you through your graduate work or postdoc or whatever. It could be very specific, like giving you advice on experiments you need to do or discussing the outline of a paper you're going to put up, right? And I think a lot of those roles get overlapped between a mentor and an advisor, but a mentor, I think, fundamentally walks into a relationship saying, I want to do no harm, right? Because they have nothing invested in it. And I think, to me, a definition of a good mentor is often, I think, dictated by the mentee and what they get out of it, because intent and impact don't have to be the same, right? So I might have great intent going into a relationship saying, I want to mentor this person, but that style of mentoring may not really work for them, right? And the impact I want to have may not be what I set out to define, right? So, so I think a lot of the definition of good is defined by the mentee and whether what they got out of it was really what they needed at that moment, and that could evolve and change over time. But I think fundamentally a mentor walks into something saying, I want to do absolutely no harm. So sometimes that means that, okay, this person needs help with this. I am not the best person to do this, but I'm going to connect them with person X so that they can go on. They never lie. They never, they're gentle, I think, at all times and kind, but I think it's slightly different because they're not, an advisor has to kind of be there to help you out. And sometimes they're not, right? And sometimes they are. So that's just my 2 cents worth to whatever was said.
Yeah, that's great. I love that, especially because, as a lot of you pointed out, an advisor isn't necessarily thinking about mentoring. They may be thinking a little bit more about research or whatever that you need to be meeting with them about. So with that said, how can we identify mentors? And I think we have both undergraduate and graduate students and maybe even some postdocs in the audience today. So thinking about identifying mentors and asking people to be mentors kind of at those different career stages.
This is what I was thinking about a little bit too, because it's something people often ask me that, and it's a little intimidating sometimes to go up and ask somebody like, will you be my mentor? Because you're worried they're going to say no. But I hate to use the analogy of dating, but sometimes it's good not to label something too early. And that this works in both contexts. Basically, if you're scoping out somebody to be a potential mentor, just go and talk to them and have conversations and see how it works out. And what ends up happening may very well be mentoring, but it's good not to just show up right out of the way. Like, I've had some undergrads I've never met before who will sometimes email me and say, will you be my mentor? It's a little bit, I mean, you can do that. Sometimes a little intimidating, like, what are you asking? I'm not sure what you're asking. Like, do you want to have like a weekly meeting or, whereas if they just came and chatted with me, it would be fine. So I recommend kind of an ease into it. It's also good for you because you may decide, actually, I don't want something so formal, or maybe this person isn't as great a mentor as I wanted, but just have conversations and ask questions and ask, like, hey, this is my perspective of things. So from the student side, that's the way I would broach it.
Yeah, I can add to that. Like, how do you approach a mentor? Was that what you asked? Or how do you identify one? I think the approach is easier if you know the person, right? And to me, I would not approach somebody you don't know to mentor you, because you have no idea what, because it depends on like, what do you want from that mentor, right? Do you just want a connection because they're famous and their name might, do you want a recommendation letter? What do you want them to recommend you for? Where do you want them to name you, take your name as a space? So I kind of think it starts out with a mentee asking themselves, where do I want to go in my career, right? And we're only discussing career. This can also apply to life, right? But it's like if you sit down and say, okay, where do I want to go? And you say, okay, you know what, this is where I really want to go into next. I want to take up communication. I really want to get better at it. Okay, then you say, okay, all of these people that I know, these 3 people are fantastic at communicating. I really love their communication style. So maybe, there's something that I can learn from them. And that would be a good way to start the conversation, because at least it's not a vague. And then I would find out a little more about those people from, the lab people they work with. Like, are they into mentoring? Do they care to mentor? Like, I think we can have some access to information. So a little bit of homework, I think, helps us all before we enter a relationship. Like I said, in the end, the impact might change depending on what you go in with, but at least if you have information, it'll allow you to strategize before you go in. That's just.
Yeah, I think this idea of knowing what you're looking for, having now, with the answer to the previous question about what is a mentor, and that actually is a very large class, of which there are smaller subclasses where individual people can be mentoring in different ways. What you're getting clear on what you're looking for from that person is key. And I think one of the reasons that that's a good thing to think about is that, as the others have mentioned, building a relationship from scratch is challenging, and it's way more challenging if you are kind of doing it for no reason. That's great. That's like how we make friends and things like that. But if you want to make a meeting with someone, usually you need a reason to have that first meeting. So it's always nice to have something you're working on. And, this is like if you're a student and looking to get closer with your thesis committee, you have maybe a talk you want to get their feedback on, or the first draft of a manuscript, or a fellowship proposal, or something like that. I think having something concrete to work on in the first conversation is a good way to both scope out what you're thinking, will this person be a good mentor? And also to sort of have something really concrete to build a relationship on. I think, as we talked about, all of us are both mentors and mentees in different ways. And one of the other words we sometimes use for a mentor is coach. And actually, through my department here, I am working with a coach, but someone who's paid to coach me. And in that context, of course, I'm going to come to her with a specific question, right? I wouldn't just like show up to the meeting and be like, so, hi. So, even though a mentorship relationship is not as transactional in that same way, it's, I think, still good to have it be directed and intentional.
Yeah, that's great. And something that came up, I think, in a few answers there was that when you're seeking a mentor, it's good to know what you're trying to get out of the relationship and set those boundaries and kind of feel out whether that relationship is going to work or not. So with that in mind, maybe we can talk a little bit about sort of the role that mentors and mentorship play in the personal and professional development of the mentee. What are some reasonable expectations for the mentee to have of a mentor?
And above all else, they believe in them. Fundamentally, if you have a mentor, they have to believe in you. And part of the relationship, I think, is they make you believe in yourself as you grow, right? So it's fundamentally, I think that's the one expectation they should have. Right? That doesn't mean that they won't tell them when something may not work their way, but it's literally built on that foundation. That's all I have for that.
Not much to add to that. Trust and communication. Those are the top ones.
Yeah, I think, maybe the one other side to that is that, because the question asked about personal and professional, which I think is an interesting way to formulate that question, that there certainly are people who will help mentor you about aspects of maybe the intersections between your personal and professional life, but that obviously all has to be within the constraints that are set by that mentor's boundaries, right? Like someone may seem to be an awesome mom and like really good at work-life balance, and they may not feel comfortable mentoring you about that. And so I think that's one of the things to sort of feel out, especially in the case where you're looking for something that's a little bit more at the intersection between personal and professional. You know, if you have a marginalized identity and you want to have a mentor or role model who shares that identity, that may not necessarily be what they're looking to contribute back. And so sort of that's, I think, one of the more delicate situations to kind of feel out. But I also feel very strongly that having those kinds of mentors is very important as well. And so going in pursuit of that is definitely valuable.
Yeah, that's a really good point that, you know, seeking out mentors who kind of reflect who you are or where you're trying to go in the same way that you might seek out a mentor who has the job that you want. You might seek someone out who you have shared experiences with. And it's good to know upfront whether that's something that they are willing and able to mentor you on, I guess, you know, navigating that road. So our next kind of question here was, what mentorship practices did you find most helpful when you were a mentee? So maybe what were some of the things that your favorite mentors did that were really effective?
One thing I liked that my advisor did, and he was both, again, my undergrad advisor was both an advisor and a mentor, but he tended to ask very open-ended questions that just got me to talk. And sometimes like things would come out that maybe I was feeling or thinking, but I wasn't even fully aware of them. But it wasn't so directed. It wasn't very precise. It wasn't like, what did you do today on this? It was like, what are you thinking about right now? What, you know, and just asking these broad, open-ended questions. It really brought out a lot of things, and it brought up topics of conversation that, you know, were under the surface and I wasn't even aware I needed to talk about, but I did. And there probably sometimes there were things that I wouldn't have been comfortable doing if he hadn't felt so like legitimately interested in me as a person and not just as, you know, lab hands or something like that. So that's something I've tried to emulate all the time. Just, you know, with my grad student who was actually just in here a few minutes ago, I try always to ask these big questions like, so what are you doing today? Like what's on your mind? What are you thinking about? What, you know, just these broad questions to try to bring out thoughts that maybe not anticipate, in addition to, of course, addressing any issues that she wants to address too. So.
Right, I would second that. So like I said, my advisor also functioned, I think, as my first mentor. And since then I've had many, like both peer and also sometimes my mentees become my mentors. But my first one was my advisor, my graduate advisor. And I think part of what Mohamed said, like he, you know, cared about people in his lab, and it was fundamental. And that was important, I think, because a part of an advisor's relationship is to critique your science, is to teach you to be critical of your science. And sometimes separating critiquing of your science from critiquing of yourself can be a very challenging task for a very young graduate student because everything feels personal, right? And the fact that this person fundamentally cared about me, you know, kind of gets you to that point where you know that, okay, you know, this is really not about me, but about learning how to critique my science. And that separation was very easy, I think, in that conversation. But also, I think he created a very permissive environment in the lab for us to be who we were, for us to have a work-life balance, for us to, I don't even think we talked about these things. It was just accepted, you know, that people were there because they wanted to be there. They could come and do what, you know, they were doing things because they wanted to do it, and we could talk to him. So I think that combination of caring about people and creating a permissive environment for us to learn and grow, to me, I think was a beautiful combination of being an advisor and a mentor. And I think it allowed him to identify what each of us wanted to do by the end of our graduate school, so that he could also set us up for, because all of us were different when we came out of grad school. We went in kind of undifferentiated stem cells, but we came out very different. And I think he could set us each up for saying, okay, you want to now go on to be a resident, you want to pursue, and you know, you want to find a postdoc in C. elegans next from, you know, pediatrics. So I think really helped him navigate us through those, at least put us in touch with people that could help us.
I love the differentiation trajectory analogy. And I feel like that is maybe, I've thought so much about this. I started my lab a year ago. And so I've thought so much about who I want to be as a mentor and what the good I want to take from my prior advisors and mentors, and maybe the things that I might do differently. And honestly, you know, I took a couple management classes. That's another word that's like built into some of these relationships is manager. Even though I do think it very much has came up in the other comments, the relationship between, say, an advisor and the advisees, and academia is obviously extremely different than the one that might happen between employer and employee externally, in as much as, in other cases, not so clear that necessarily your boss has to like care about you as a person. And yet in academia, being a mentee in a lab whose PI does not care about them as a person is incredibly psychologically damaging. In part because so much life happens while you're in grad school and a postdoc. I cannot tell you, so I've only been in this a year, and there's already just been so much life happening to the people in my lab that affects their science and affects their day. But anyway, so I think the thing that I've gone to these like mentorship classes or management classes to try and be a better manager. And honestly, what it comes down to, a big part of what they're saying is that people are different. And that they're sort of giving you frameworks to understand those differences, and especially cases where they're different from you. And that ability to tailor, I think, is the most important, but also from my perspective so far, the most challenging, particularly to work with people who are not little carbon copies of you and figure out what they want, what they need to achieve that. And honestly, you can ask. I ask my students and my postdocs what motivates them. Because I think the biggest break point in a lot of academia is whether or not you've lost motivation to come in that day. And it's different for different people. This course I took, they had people shout out what motivates them. And the list is long, right? A lot of people are motivated by making their families proud, or they're motivated by money, or they're motivated by being the first person to make a discovery, or they're motivated by working in teams, or like me, they're motivated by fear of failure. There's sort of a lot of possible options, some of which would never cross my radar if I didn't ask. So I think that's the big sort of component to me, is this idea of sort of individualizing as best as possible.
Hey, I add something real quick to that. I thought it was a fantastic point. What's interesting too that I found with a lot of my trainees is that what motivates them changes over time, and what they need also changes radically over time. Like what they need when they're first coming in versus what they need or what they're perceiving, at the end of a 5-year PhD, radically different. So it's again, the analogy people often use is parenting. Like, how you parent your 5-year-old is not how you parent your 15-year-old. And if you try to, it's going to fail miserably. So you have to adapt with your trainee as they're growing and changing what they're doing and coming to new realizations about themselves.
Yeah, I can agree from, as a mentee, that my favorite mentors are always the people who I feel like I'm not going in to meet with them about science. I'm just going in to chat with them. And then we end up talking about science sometimes and other things other times, but they're always, aware of trying to meet you where you are, which I think is a really, really great approach. So we're going to fit in, I think, maybe one more question here about the mentee perspective, and then we'll swap over to the mentor's perspective. So let's see. What do you think, is the best way to communicate expectations to a mentor? So you kind of talked about some of the approaches that you really liked. If you know that you respond really well to a mentor who does specific things, is there a good way to communicate that to them? Is it something you should do in the first meeting, or what do you think?
Just so I understand, this is from a mentee's perspective. So how does a mentee communicate expectations to a mentor?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, hopefully the first time they send an email or or they ask, or they come up to you in a meeting or something, they basically tell you why they're speaking to you. Like, after the initial introduction, you know what I mean? Because if you don't know the person, right? If you know the person, I don't think this question would come up, because you would just walk up to them and ask them, say, do you, if whenever you have some time, can we sit down and talk about, something that's worrying me or on my mind, right? This is if you know the person. If you don't know the person, you probably will have to preface it with why you want to talk to them, because otherwise all of us freak out because we're like, did I do something? Like, what did I do? What did I say? It's like all of us are like, oh my God, why does this person want to talk to me? So I think it's easiest to, if you do not know the person, it's easiest to, I think, say why, what it is that brought you to talk to them. So you can say, I heard this panel I was on, or I heard from your student that I ran into, or I met the student from your lab or your program, and they said that you were, really good at this, and and I'm really looking for help on this, right? So would you be willing to, help me or work with me. Right. So I think that's at least one way that might be comfortable. I think it's organic. It depends, but that's one way to start.
Yeah, I think you can do some of it in behavior too. I mean, this sort of general concept of managing up. There's actually, it was a nice article in Nature maybe 10 years ago called like the care and management of your advisor or something. And I think that because these relationships are hierarchical, it can be easy to feel like if you're in the like lower power position that, what are you going to do about changing the behavior of the person in the higher power position? But you're an active agent in the process, I guess is what I would say as the mentee. And so if you can, even if you can't maybe have an explicit conversation with the mentor necessarily about, here's exactly what I want from you, or like, here's where I feel you're falling short of what would best serve me, you can start to direct things. I think the way that you come into any of your meetings, whether you send an email ahead of time, whether you make an agenda that you say, here's, the plan for this meeting, whether you schedule a follow-up meeting specifically ahead of time, all of those things can kind of shape how those conversations go. And obviously in this case, I'm kind of talking about a mentor, like a formal advisor mentor / situation. But there are definitely opportunities to sort of recognize where your advisor is not meeting your needs and actually sort of massage the situation to get them met.
Really have anything to add, but I'll actually build on one just small piece of something that Kara said. One thing I do with all my grad students is we have a shared meeting agenda, and it's just online. It's a Google Doc, and it just has both our names at the top. And as I think of things before our meetings that I want to talk about, I put it on there. As they think of things they want to have in our meeting before we talk about, they put it on there. Everybody walks into the meeting knowing what every party wants to talk about. So that's something that's useful for all parties in those meetings. It just makes them also more efficient too, because I mean, you can't usually have like a 4-hour meeting with your trainee. Like usually there's something scheduled. So it just makes sure that, as you're going through, like, oh, okay, we want to talk about these things. And then actually during the meeting, she'll bring her laptop, I'll have my computer, and we'll actually be like making sure we hit everything and that we're keeping on time so that we can cover all the things that need to be covered, or triaging as necessary. Maybe we'll be like, this piece isn't that important. We'll come back to that next time because this is really important. And I know you really want to talk about this. So.
Yeah, nice advice there. All right, we're going to shift gears a little bit here, and now we're going to think about things from the perspective of a mentor. So maybe how the three of you are used to thinking about things a little bit more now. So starting out, how can a mentor kind of develop an independent mentorship style? And do you have an independent mentorship style? And if you do, has that changed over time? And sort of how has that developed?
Right. So I'm going to ask you for definition of independent. Like, do you mean like me without asking for help? Is that what you mean by independent?
Well, I guess because maybe from former mentors, you've gotten a set of skills that, like my old mentor did this, I really liked it, so now I'm going to repeat that, but making it your own and developing that style. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So I certainly borrowed from my graduate advisor heavily because I really thought that having, being able to create an environment that's permissive really, I think, makes a huge difference with keeping lines of communication open, being always honest. Like I feel like I'm almost always too honest. Anytime my mentee asks me a question, if it pertains specifically to science and they say, this is what I want to do, what do you think? I absolutely tell them pros and cons, like of what we can do, what we can't do, where we can get help outside. And, and that's on an advisor level. On a mentor level, I kind of feel like my mentoring style has, and I think this is true for everybody, it evolves with time. It evolves with the mentee, right? So sometimes I realize that, for example, depends on who is. So one thing that I like to do is I like to have protected space on my calendar for each of my, for everybody in my lab, irrespective of titles, right? Where they sit down with me and talk. And this can be about their data. This can be about their life. This can be about, the winter in Houston. It's 30 degrees today, so it's winter in Houston. But, but sometimes what ends up happening is a lot of times people are like, I have nothing to discuss. Like I literally have nothing to talk about, right? And so then they tell me whether they want to meet or not. But sometimes a lot of people, like, I've had people that have interviewed or have rotated in the lab that are not comfortable with a standing meeting, even if they can cancel it, even if it's perfectly okay for them to just cancel it week after week for like months on end. They're not comfortable with that because they would just rather come to me whenever they have a need. So then in that case, I end up changing my style because that's what they are comfortable with, right? And so then we end up, and I actually tell them, I was like, okay, if this is what you're comfortable with, then what'll happen is after 3 months, I'll start freaking out because I just want to make sure you're doing okay, that, you're not just scientifically, but in many ways, because a lot of people in my lab, don't have like they're graduate students and don't have families in town. And they more or less live alone. So then I worry about like, okay, if I haven't seen this kid at all for like 3 months, I mean, I see them in lab, but that's not the same as just sitting down and saying, okay, are things okay? So in that case, I tell them, okay, I understand that you don't want to meet with me every week during this protected time, even if you can cancel it, but let's come up with a middle ground, right? Maybe we'll meet in 2 months or 6 weeks, or you just shoot me an email and say, hey, everything's fine, right? And that's fine too. So I think it evolves, is what I would say. It definitely evolves based on the feedback I get, based on what works for someone and what doesn't work for someone. And I still try to use my best practices on what I think works, but it's very organic. That's how I would say it.
I can hop in there. I love what Swathi said. Actually, I will say I disagree with one thing Swathi said. One thing my students sometimes say that they don't want a weekly meeting. I always insist on it, partly because I have an administrative role, so I'm actually harder to get, like, just middle of the time. So I always say, like, even if you don't have anything, just come over, we'll chit chat, and if nothing happens, you'll leave. And sometimes, yeah, they'll do that. We'll chit chat for 15 minutes, they'll leave. Probably 50% of the time when they say they don't have anything, it turns out they do. And then they weren't aware. So like I'll ask a question and they'll be like, oh, I forgot to ask you about blah, blah, blah. So that tends to work. But again, it's potentially different because, like I said, I'm in an administrative role. I'm often not even in the same building. So it's not so easy just to swing by my lab. I completely agree about things evolving. And I've probably got the most gray hair of people here. And I'll say that some of the things that I used to do when I first started as a mentor, and this is things I potentially had adopted from past mentors, not my undergrad one, but other past mentors. Years later, I look back and I'm like, wow, that's like borderline toxic. I don't want to do that anymore. And it was very helpful to, go to workshops and talk with people about mentoring style and just honestly just give it a lot of thought. And things, I'll use actually one concrete example so you don't think it was worse than it was. One of my former advisors, not the undergrad one, used to have people when they'd come in, if they come into work on a holiday, they'd sign the wall. And it was supposed to be this celebration of like, oh, look, you're working so hard. I didn't realize at the time that's actually kind of toxic because it's basically kind of forcing people not to have, or that it's bad in some way, or you're lacking a reward by taking a holiday when you should be taking a holiday. So, I did that for my first couple of years, and then thinking about like, this actually is not good. And so we stopped. So sometimes it's correcting mistakes as we go on, because again, like we often don't get formal training. Kara mentioned the formal training options are great. I know my university has workshops on mentoring. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it is, as Kara said too, it's just like people are different. And a lot of it is that, and how do you work with people with different personality styles? You probably can guess I'm an E on the extrovert scale. Sometimes I have trainees who are way on the other end, and there's some balancing, right, where my expectations of them just going to reach out to me when they have a problem is unrealistic because that's not their style whatsoever. So learning about that and learning what are strategies that people use when they have that particular difference has been useful for me as well. So.
Yeah, I would say I'm still trying to figure out maybe what my mentoring style is. And in as much, especially as it's shaped by the people in your lab. And so we're still in the earlier stages of that. I do think that I'm trying to think of how to formulate all of these things. One thought is, I do think it's helpful to be mentored about mentoring, for example. There are a lot of things that can happen around a new lab or any lab that you, especially at the faculty level, there's some sense that you're kind of, I mean, it's true, the buck stops with you, but it doesn't mean that you have to go it alone. This is something that like I tell everyone all the time, is that just because, we say that your training is designed to make you into an independent scientist. That does not mean it's designed to turn you into someone who does everything on your own. In fact, it's not that you don't need help anymore. It's just that you become more responsible for getting the help yourself. So like honest to God, the most help I've ever needed in my life was this past year, starting a new lab. It is not like, grad school, you start and then you kind of got it by the end. So it's not that you don't need the help. You need more help. No one's going to show up at your door and say, hey, you need some help. And the same is true, I think, of mentoring, that I think that there are a lot of things that come up that people around you have also experienced. I think it was fascinating, actually. Separately from the management course I took as a postdoc, we were all required to take this CIMER mentoring training, which I think is kind of going around all of the schools right now. And I was really astounded at how many situations the more senior faculty diagnosed as being a mental health problem of the trainee. And I think basically my point of that is that the more senior faculty have experience, and sometimes they do things old school ways, and you maybe don't want to do their old school ways, but you can get help basically at being a better mentor. There's what you learn as the mentee, but then as you encounter new experiences while being the mentor yourself, you really don't have to go it alone. I think there are people, professionals like these coaches who can help guide you through specific problems, but also I think I've heard from my faculty mentors that particularly when something started to go a little bit wrong with the personnel in the lab, it took them too long to go ask for help about how to manage it. And they sort of fought it out for a while. And then when they went to talk to someone, the person they went to talk to was like, oh, you should have come to me a while ago. I could have helped. And instead they're like staying up at night, freaking out about it. And they could have been given tools to help manage it.
Yeah, some kind of themes just from the whole workshop coming up here that, first, being a good mentor sometimes means adapting to what the mentee needs and being flexible and finding where that compromise is what's going to make you a successful mentor and what's going to make them a successful mentee. And that also, even once you are a mentor, you still need mentors. You're still relying on that network that you've built to help you to, even with building your own mentorship strategy, right? So with that, what can graduate students and postdocs do to kind of gain mentorship experience? We've kind of talked a little bit about like not getting a lot of training directly in management or mentorship, and then once you get to be a faculty or in a management position, you're expected to know how to do these things, right? So what can graduate students and postdocs do to gain mentoring experience, especially maybe if they're in a lab or an institute where they can't mentor undergraduate students in the lab?
The last part put a twist on it there.
I completely agree with Mohamed. I think not having the ability to mentor somebody is strongly affects your learning capacity there, right? Because at least I think what all of us probably do is when somebody tells me they are interested in mentoring, right? We recruit a undergrad student or a summer student, and the person mentors them. And then I continue to have meetings with both of them, right? But I have a meeting with my student or postdoc who's mentoring, but here now I'm talking to them about mentorship, right? And how what they did or what they didn't do may or may not affect that students, and why those responses may be the way they are, and how you can make it, better or get more out of it. And I can also talk to the mentee about how to communicate with the mentor, right? And that, so not having access to that is very challenging. Maybe one thing that could be done is, you become a peer mentor. You become a mentor to somebody in your lab who's your baymate or your benchmate on something, that, in the end, not all of us work on the same thing in the lab. Most of us work on very different things. But one thing you could start to do is maybe think about, again, if you start out with, I want to do no harm, I want to help this person, right? So if you say, okay, I have this baymate and I really want to help them succeed, and I know from all of these lab meetings I go to with them and I sit right next to them, I know that they have this handicap. And maybe I can actually figure out how we can fix it together, right? And they could work on becoming a peer mentor with that person if they don't have access. I do recommend what Kara brought up earlier, which is taking up like workshops if they're available in your place. I took a whole bunch of them when I started out as faculty. I enjoyed them. We had a bunch of them called Heart of Leadership and others, and sometimes they're available to graduate students and postdocs. Sometimes they're not. So if they're available, I would definitely take those. But if they're not, then you always have, and if you don't have somebody on your bay let's say you're the only student in the lab because you joined a brand new lab, right? Then there are people on the floor, right? Go up to them, start talking to people on your floor. Like, in fact, I used to do this when I started as a junior faculty. I used to miss having people in my lab. I didn't have that many because it takes a while to build a group. Every Friday, I would just, it was called my mental day off. I would go to people on the floor, introduce myself, and start talking to students and postdocs about their project. And over a course of like a year, I got to know them all, right? You don't have to talk to all of them, but you could start introducing yourself to other students from other programs that might be working in adjacent labs and start out by identifying how you could help each other. Or you could be a formal mentor, like you could tell yourself, I'm a mentor to this person. I don't know if that.
I love all those things. I mean, one thing that I've done sometimes is co-mentor a student. You know, so like, let's say if you don't have an undergrad, maybe a rotation student or something like that. And by co-mentor is just basically like have three-way meetings. And it really helps because then, you know, you as the new mentor get to see what the more senior mentor is doing. And it's also an opportunity for the senior mentor to, you know, privately, not in front of the mentee, say like, hey, maybe next time, don't quite say it that way, say it this way. You know, it's just an opportunity to try to correct and adjust as things are going. There are sometimes formal programs. I know Duke had a program here going for a while where people would actually come and sit with, like another grad student would come sit with me in my meetings with my grad student. And it was just an opportunity to see like, oh, how is this working another thing? And she would sit there and like, I would have my meeting with my student. And then afterwards, I would sort of hash it out with her. And, you know, she would say like, so why did you ask blah, blah, blah? I'm like, oh, let me tell you. And I'll relay my parts. I will say, and this came up from both my colleagues, Swathi and Kara earlier, it's a two-way thing. Sometimes they point out to me like, well, have you ever thought about blah? I'm like, oh my God, I hadn't. You know, so we do learn from these experiences as mentors, as well as the, you know, as senior mentors, as well as junior mentors too. So it's a great opportunity for just, you know, trading strategies and learning all together.
Yeah, I do think that this idea that, you know, maybe if there's not undergraduates available at your institution, there might be master students or rotation students or more junior graduate students, something like that. Because I do really think that the opportunity to get explicit feedback on your mentoring that you have more often as a trainee is really important. I can say that, you know, for myself as a graduate student, I mentored a master student for 6 months and I 100% messed it up. I did a terrible job. I was way too hard on her. And it was just my first experience with someone who did not work the way I worked, really, where that, you know, the goal, you know, we shared a common goal. And so her trajectory was important for moving my science forward as well. And it was really important that I could kind of fail locally there. Like if I had not had that experience, I think I would have been a terrible PI. And it would, you know, I would have probably gotten better, hopefully, but it would have been a rough trial by fire situation. So I think these more local scenarios, especially where there's a backup mentor in the form of your lab's PI and someone who can really take you aside and be like, that's not going to work. It's really valuable. So I love the idea of trying to find that however you can and being really clear that you're doing it because you want to learn to be a better mentor, that you're really looking for feedback.
And don't take it personally. I mean, just because you give advice to a mentee doesn't mean they have to take it, right? I mean, they sometimes when they're talking to you, you know, they might realize, oh, okay, I you know, she laid all that out. Maybe that's not what I want, because usually all of us go home, process, internalize, and come to more decisions, you know. So as a mentor, don't take it personally. Don't say that, oh, you know, I told this person to do this and they didn't do it. It's okay. It's all right. You know, it's just your job is to do the best you can and continue to believe in them. And that's perfectly okay.
Yeah, something else I guess I was thinking about is if you don't have the opportunity to mentor students, there are still, you know, transferable skills maybe that you can be working to build. Are there any specific skills that you all have found really useful that have helped you to be a better mentor? Obviously, something like communication skills comes to mind, but maybe something else.
Communication, really. Right? I mean, that's really a thing, and it's not as trivial as, you know. I mean, while we all think about communication, it's definitely a constantly evolving process to get that, you know, to get communication precise. Right. But in addition to that, I think I don't know. I can't think of another like fundamental, you know. If I think of it, I'll let you know.
Okay, that's fine. We're going to move then to our final closing question for the workshop today. And that is just to open it up for any of our panelists to give any suggestions or tips to our attendees with no prompt. So, thinking about kind of the broad discussion we've had today about mentorship, how to be a good mentor, how to find mentors, the skills that you need to make that happen. What do you want to leave the attendees with today?
First and foremost, kudos to you all for being at a workshop to try to train how to be a mentor. I wish I had taken more of these things when I was a trainee before I was actually supervising people. It was almost criminal that I just got sent out there in front of people. I guess if I had to pick one thing, I'd say remember diversity in all axes. I mean, I think both my co-presenters have raised this point before. Analogy I like to use about this kind of thing, especially if you're fairly senior and you're talking to somebody fairly junior, the version of it I say is that you're swinging around an invisible hammer with the words that you're saying. So it's really, really important to be careful, not just what advice you give, but how you give it and how you word specific things, how you word feedback. Think deeply before the comments that you make, that because you can have a huge impact positively or non-positively, depending on how you put comments out there. That's probably the single biggest thing. Beyond that, I mean, the issues of communication, the more you can get other people to talk as opposed to you talking at them, the more you can get them to talk to you, the better your outcomes usually are, because A, you get a lot more information out there in terms of their motivations and what they want. You can probably give them the best possible answer. But B, it gets around this, it alleviates the diversity problem, because you'll see, what are their motivations, what are their goals, how can we achieve this? So, my 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree with Mohammed. I mean, if I have to leave some final, at least for now, with what my brain is functioning, I would say really two things. One is be intentional, right? Be intentional have intent and good intent, like be precise, be intentional in addressing the points that the mentee is bringing up. And just as we tell them, say, I don't know, when you don't know an answer, it's okay to tell your mentee that I do not know how to help you with that, but I'm going to find out and I'm going to connect you to somebody who will, because, or at least, we'll navigate this together. Let's figure out how we can go about it, because that takes away this whole idea that somehow you know everything. And I think it makes it easier for you to, and it also leaves you space to for your mentee to realize, okay, that this person doesn't know everything. Like, while I adore them, they're not perfect, right? So I would say those two things, but precision and conversation and being intentional about, making sure your point is clear and what you want from them and what you want for them is, I think, important.
And sitting here a little bit freaking out about what to say, because it feels like a lot of pressure for it to be the final thoughts we leave you with. And also, I really have to say, I'm actually learning so much from my other panelists here. So I'm really very grateful to have been invited to be a part of this. So having said that, I don't pass too much judgment on my final thoughts. I think this is maybe going to be a statement about mentoring within the context of being the PI. One of the harder things about that is figuring out how to navigate this relationship where you're the mentor and the boss at the same time. And the reason I bring that up is that one way to be a better mentor that has come up a couple of times is to get feedback on your mentoring. And you want to be able to create a line of communication that is to some extent two-way about that. So obviously one of your jobs as the PI is to help your people grow. And so therefore you would be giving them constructive feedback. And yet you also want to solicit their feedback of you in a way that will help you be a better mentor to them, while at the same time respecting that, at least in my opinion, you really need to stay the boss to help everyone have their best experience in the lab. So having to me, that's one of the more challenging things, is to ask for feedback in a way that makes it clear that you're not peers. And that is something that I've been kind of working on myself. I do a 6-month check-in with the trainees that sort of is partly about their project and, you know, things they're proud of, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things I ask is, you know, name one thing I'm doing well to support you, name one thing I could be doing better to support you. And figuring out how to sort of walk through that. And again, not to take it personally. The advice I was given, and I stand by this, is to receive that feedback initially in written form so that you can process it before you go into the meeting with them, and figure out how you want to address it. Because there will be some things. This is one of the things that I most respect about the relationship that I had with Ian, the advisor I told you was my favorite mentor. He never shut me down. The number of things I thought I knew what was up, and now as a PI, I'm like, I had no idea. And there I was, like, voicing my opinion on this thing that I so deeply should not have had an opinion on. But he never shut me down. And actually, if he had shut me down, I think it would have really damaged my ability to see myself in his job. And so figuring out how to say, you know, how to not necessarily take all feedback and execute exactly what they ask if it's not the right thing for the team, while at the same time letting them know that their feedback is valued, is a challenging thing to walk. But I think, as the others have said, you know, the main thing is making sure your lines of communication are clear, and that if, as best as possible, everyone can interpret something as more likely to be a misunderstanding than malice, it's going to be okay.
Thank you all so much. So we have come to the end of today's workshop. Thank you to all of the attendees for being here today. And thank you, of course, to the panelists for taking time to share their experiences and insights with us. This has been a really wonderful panel today. And for our attendees, stay tuned for the next Workshop Wednesday events that we have coming up, which will take place at the upcoming GSA conferences on March 10th, Fungal 2022, in April, the Drosophila conference, and in June, the PEQG conference. We will be preparing the resource package from today's workshop and sending that out to all the attendees. So please keep track of us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and through email to get updates from us as soon as we're done, so we can distribute those resources to you. So thank you so much, everybody, and stay safe. And we hope to see you at another Workshop Wednesday soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
And everybody, if you have feedback for
thanks.
us, please email us and let us know what we can do better.
Yeah.
Definitely.